Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada. And today I am very pleased to be joined by Qasim Rashid. Qasim is a human rights lawyer, author, and former congressional candidate in the United States. He's also served as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Islamic Studies program. His human rights work includes supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, representing asylum seekers, uplifting the incarcerated through prison chaplaincy, and advocating for universal religious freedom. He's published numerous books and law review articles, and his work has been published across the media spectrum from Time, the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and USA Today. He runs a popular Substack with more than 80,000 subscribers titled Let's Address This with Qasim Rashid. Qasim and his wife, Ayesha, reside with their 3 children in the Chicagoland area. Thank you so much for joining me today, Qasim.
Privileged to be here, Dimitri. Thank you for having me.
So, Qasim, in recent months, North America has seen numerous alarming acts of violence against Palestinian Muslims and their supporters. And I'll just mention 3 or 4 that have happened since this genocidal rampage began in Gaza in October of last year. In that month, a child by the name of Wadia al-Fayoum, 6-year-old Palestinian American boy, was killed when he was stabbed 26 times in his home in Illinois, where you're based. His mother, Hanan Shaheen, was also stabbed and strangled, leaving her critically injured. As I understand it, authorities describe the killing as a hate crime motivated by Islamophobia and anti-Palestinianism. In the following month, 3 Palestinian students were shot in Vermont. Yeah. Although they all survived, one of them had a bullet lodged in his spine, and it was unclear if he'd ever walk again. These were both, I think, widely publicized crimes. Last month, a 42-year-old woman in Texas named Elizabeth Wolf allegedly attempted to drown a Palestinian Muslim child in their apartment complex's pool, where the child lived with his mother. And the woman asked the mother where they were from and if the child was hers before attacking him. These are the allegations of the police. Obviously, when the mother came to rescue the child, the attacker ripped off the mother's hijab, beating the mother and attempting to keep her away as the attacker continued to trying to drown her 3-year-old daughter. And a neighbor attempted to rescue the children as the attacker was taken away while screaming, "Tell her I will kill her and I will kill her whole family." And finally, just 2 weeks ago, an assailant in London, Ontario, the city where I happen to be born and raised, set fire to the home of a Palestinian Muslim family after warning them about a Free Palestine sign on their property. Fire crews thankfully managed to extinguish the blaze and no injuries were reported. However, the fire caused approximately $30,000 in damage to the home, so it was a serious act of arson. So, Qasim, this is by no means an exhaustive list. Tragically, I could go on. But what do you make of all of this? Is North America, in your opinion, seeing a sharp rise in Islamophobia, and particularly violent Islamophobia? And if so, what do you think the causes of this alarming increase are?
Well, look, I think these examples that you all gave are painful, they're real, and especially in the case of Wadia al-Fayoum, this was a horrific hate crime that happened not 15 minutes from where I live. I met with his father, I met with his family, and it was a very painful funeral, very painful visual. The FBI data is pretty clear that hate crimes against any minority community in the United States are on the rise, have been on the rise for some time now. And we're seeing a consistency, not just in hate crimes, but also in legislation and policy marginalizing historically marginalized communities. Everything from the repeal of affirmative action to ending Black scholarships to banning DEI, banning critical race theory, whatever that is, an unjust immigration policy. And I think a lot of this has to do, there's 2 main reasons behind it. One, the broader reason, and then 2, kind of the more specific reason. The broader reason is fundamentally, unlike other nations that have a history of genocide and enslavement and atrocity, the United States has never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's never paid reparations. It's never truly acknowledged or grappled with the fact that this country was founded on the genocide of one people and the enslavement and genocide of another people. I'm talking about indigenous peoples and Africans enslaved and brought to the United States. We've never grappled with the fact that white enslavers got reparations for losing the people that they had enslaved, but the enslaved never got reparations for being enslaved or having to suffer through enslavement. And you look at the fact that even the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment never actually ended slavery, just relegated to the prison system. And then you had 100 years of Jim Crow after that. So now we're seeing kind of this ongoing assault, and I use that word deliberately, on Americans who are Muslim. And this is not just a domestic matter, it's an international matter. There's a striking report published a few years ago called Unworthy Victims that documents how many Muslim civilians have been killed since 1990 by Western bombing. And that number is 4 million at least, which is a shocking number to think about. 4 million, right? We rightly and unequivocally condemn the Holocaust for killing 6 million Jewish people and other marginalized communities. Yet here, 4 million Muslims are killed through Western bombing. And I guarantee you 99% of people have no idea about that. And so then the micro part of it, that's kind of the broader issue. I think on the micro part of it is because of these historic injustices, we haven't created a narrative on what justice actually looks like. We haven't created a narrative on having people speak out in media, tell a story, write the story, and in a way that is understandable to folks. And some might be critical of me for making that comment, but the fact of the matter remains is people don't know. And we need to do more on our end, despite the fact that so many Muslims are being killed and marginalized and martyred. This is why I speak out, because I've been fortunate to have built a platform. And to me, it's critical to have these dialogues to ensure that people have an understanding of what's going on and then how to solve these problems as well.
It's interesting you mentioned Truth and Reconciliation. Here in Canada, we did have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. Of course, our record on Black enslavement and discrimination against Blacks is, I would say, not nearly as horrifying as it is in the United States. But there's never really been any, I think, systematic attempt to deal with discrimination against Blacks. With respect to Indigenous peoples, there was. And certainly, I think it helped the situation of Indigenous peoples and it improved the conversation. It brought a lot of awareness. But I just want to point out that systemic discrimination against Indigenous peoples is very much ongoing in this country. The dispossession of the Indigenous peoples from their lands, the abuses of their inalienable rights as Indigenous peoples, as human beings. It's ongoing. So, for example, we have, I think, 30% of the prison population in Canada approximately is Indigenous. They constitute 4% of the population. So we are a long way away from having dealt with this issue adequately. We made an important step in terms of Truth and Reconciliation. I agree with you completely that is an important and helpful step, but we have a lot of work to do in this country as well. So I just want to, sort of bring that into the conversation. Switching gears a little bit, when a mutual acquaintance brought you to my attention, I was quite impressed by a number of things about your background. And for people who are listening to our conversation, I didn't know Qasim before a couple of weeks ago. One of the things I learned is that when you were running to be a candidate for Congress as a Democrat, you were yourself, and probably before that time, targeted with Islamophobic smears, including by another candidate. I don't know if he was your opponent or if he was from another district.
The constituent, actually.
The constituent, and his name was Oscar Dillon.
Yeah.
So could you tell us about what you've experienced in terms of Islamophobia in your political endeavors, and what happened in particular with this person, Oscar Dillon, because I think it's quite interesting.
Well, even prior to running, death threats were the norm. I have testified in federal court against the person who wanted to kill me for my faith, and we successfully convicted him, which is good because it set a precedent that online death threats are still real death threats, and you will be held accountable for those. So, I was, again, fortunate to have access to legal counsel, legal means to be able to prosecute, push the prosecution both in criminal court and civil court. and ensure that this person was held accountable. And really my focus was, let's be successful in this prosecution. So next time somebody issues a death threat from behind a screen, they can't just anonymously run away. They'll have to suffer the consequences for that violent death threat. And I want to be clear. I get vulgar and vile comments all the time. They're vulgar, they're vile, they're not criminal, right? Somebody can call me a camel jockey or the sand N-word. It's vulgar, it's vile, but that doesn't rise to criminal intent in my view. But if somebody threatens to kill me or my children, yes, you absolutely better believe that there will be criminal prosecutions and civil prosecutions following that. In this particular case with Oz Dillon, it was a vile and vulgar comment. It was not a death threat of any sort, at least not initially. And when he tweeted me something nasty, I was about to block and move on, but happened to look at his profile, noticed that he had crushing medical debt, which in Canada doesn't exist for the most part. But here it's very common. 500,000 Americans file for medical bankruptcy annually because we live in this capitalistic dystopia that's right now. And I decided to contribute 50, 60 bucks to his campaign and tweet it out to my social media platform. It went viral, and within 24 hours, his entire medical debt of $25,000 was paid off. And my whole point in the tweet was, this person hates me. What I wrote in the tweet was, this person hates me for my faith as a Muslim. My faith teaches service to all humanity, not just those who like me. And so I've contributed. If you can contribute, please do as well, because that's what people should do to take care of one another. The interesting thing was that he responded, thanking me and apologizing. And I think people saw that as the win. To me, that wasn't the win. There were two wins independent of that. Winning him over wasn't really the goal at any point. If it happened, great. But to me, the win was, here's a person suffering needlessly, and maybe we can alleviate that suffering. And when we did that, that to me was the main win. The second main win was the literally thousands and thousands of messages and notes I received from people saying, hey, I didn't know much about Islam, or I actually had a negative view of Islam and Muslims. But if this is what Islam teaches in service to humanity, then yeah, count me in. I'm sold. This is great. And you've given me some solid examples of how I can push back against the bigotry in the future. I mean, literally thousands, Dimitri, of messages. And it was a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I consider those two the wins is that about 2 months later, this same person who was initially a bigot and then profuse with his praise and support reverted back to his old ways and started sending me nasty messages.
Wow.
Violent as well. And people said, well, don't you feel kind of salty that he did that? And I said, no, for two reasons. One, the purpose of service to humanity from an Islamic perspective is that it's based on absolute justice. You don't just help people because they like you. You help people because they're people, and it's the right thing to do, period. And you don't do it because you believe you'll get some reward from God. You do it because the reward is helping humanity in and of itself. And two, the fact that I was able to affect in a positive way thousands of people into understanding that, hey, here is how across faith, across culture, across ethnicity, we can find ways to collaborate and work together. And people responded that helped them become better people. That to me was a huge win. So that's kind of the way I function on these things. It's not very easy, and I certainly was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. But I think that is how we counter the Islamophobia and the bigotry one person at a time.
Sorry to hear that this person reverted to hatred. I'm just curious, and maybe you can't offer an opinion. Obviously, you can't read his mind. Is your sense that this was a cynical political calculation on his part, that he thought if he reverted to this type of behavior, he would win over a certain constituency? Or do you think this is just some deep-seated emotional or intellectual infirmity that he suffers from that caused him to revert?
Yeah, I think probably more the latter. Look, it's not easy. James Baldwin once said that I think one reason people hold on to hate so much is that if they let go of the hate, they have to deal with the pain. And sometimes it's just easier to hold on to the hate. I'm paraphrasing, but I think with him, it's a very red part of the country, red part of the district. I know all of his friends were hardcore, MAGA Trumpers, and they probably saw, I know, well, initially he told me they're making fun of me for being duped by a Muslim. And I said, well, hopefully we can win their hearts as well. But obviously when you're surrounded by that, I kind of liken it to someone who suffers from addiction. That, the first thing you need to do is get them away from the community that they're around, because they're going to enable the addiction even more. And even if somebody goes to rehab and comes out clean, if they go back to that same community, eventually they're going to suffer, statistically speaking, the same addictions that they were suffering before. And so, it can be difficult, even if you are able to win a heart. It can be difficult to maintain that if they're still surrounded by the same people who are engaged in negativity and hatred. And I think that's what happened here.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, you ran as a Democrat.
Right.
In the interests of full disclosure, Qasim, I have been relentlessly critical of and by the way, I have an even lower regard for Republicans. Let's be very clear about that. As far as I'm concerned, that party should be abolished. But I don't feel much better about the Democrats, particularly nowadays, to be honest about it. And the number one reason, but by no means the exclusive reason, of course, is the genocide in Gaza, which I believe would not be, practically speaking, possible to consummate were it not for the massive amount of weapons that our dear friend Genocide Joe has been funneling to the Israelis. And I also believe that this is a flagrant violation of the Genocide Convention, and that, Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, they're all war criminals and they should be tried at The Hague. So I don't say any of that to, offend you, and I'm sorry if I did, but that's my honest view. And I'm very curious to know how you feel nowadays in light of what we've seen over the last 8 months, this horror, unending horror in Gaza and other parts of occupied Palestine, about being a Democrat.
Look, being a Democrat to me means upholding justice above all else. And I likewise have not been shy about being critical of the president and the Secretary of State and Democrats in Congress for enabling these war crimes in Gaza, enabling what is documented and recognized as a genocide in Gaza. And I'm not happy is the wrong word. I'm unhesitating to say that publicly, that these are war crimes, that this is enabling a genocide, and it needs to stop. So, at the end of the day, you can go with the philosophy of, well, both parties are corrupt and we need a third party. Okay, well then build that infrastructure. I haven't seen it. To me, the Democratic Party still has the best chance of maintaining a modicum of democracy, of decency. And I think the polling shows that the majority of Democratic voters believe that as well. More than half of Democratic voters believe it's a genocide. And so we're not at the point of the entire party being corrupted like the Republican Party, in my view, has become today. And it's up to us to hold our electeds accountable. This is one area where I knock heads with a lot of other Democrats who are, say, well, how are you critical of Biden? Don't you know that Trump is going to be far worse? And my point to them is, I think Biden recognizes that Trump is going to be far worse, which makes it all the more exacerbating and exhausting that he's enabling the Trump of Israel, somebody who's even more Trump than Trump in Israel. If you know that Donald Trump is going to destroy democracy, why wouldn't you take more assertive actions to prevent him from coming into power? Why wouldn't you uphold international human rights law? The fact that we now have a binding UN Security Council resolution to immediately release all hostages and a complete ceasefire and a withdrawal from Gaza, one that the Israeli War Cabinet, no less, approved, one that President Biden approved and pushed through the UN without vetoing. It's a binding resolution. And now, just on the 23rd, Netanyahu comes out and says, no, we're not going to abide by that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a violation of international law. Where's the accountability? Why are we continuing to send arms to a person who's openly flouting and openly opposing basic international humanitarian law and admitting to it, right? At start of this siege on Gaza, it was, well, no, we would never bomb a hospital, or no, we would never bomb a refugee camp. And now they're openly doing it, openly denying UN resolutions. And our response is just to kind of sit there and say, well, we got to figure out some other way. Well, no, we know the way, and we need to hold accountability. And I say this as someone who is a Democrat, because at the end of the day, these are the principles that the Democratic Party is supposed to uphold, and I'm not going to deviate from that. And at the end of the day, if our standard is justice, then we need to do that, even when it's allegedly hard. Otherwise, I think Jon Stewart said this really well, talking about Guantanamo Bay, when he said that if the only time you uphold your values is when it's easy, then those aren't values, those are hobbies. And we need to move beyond the hobby state into an actual practicing what we preach state. And so that's going to be my commitment. Whether I run for office in the future, who knows? But my standard is going to be to uphold justice no matter what. And if that means being critical of my own party, I think that's what you want. I think you want someone who's going to be able to push our party into a position of upholding decency and human rights law. Otherwise, we're no different than what the Republican Party has become.
Since we're on the subject of U.S. politics, I wanted to ask you about APAC. You know, we often hear that APAC controls Congress, and this is a view, for example, which I'm simplifying it, but this is certainly, I think, a view what can fairly be said is espoused by John Mearsheimer, the famous political scientist from the University of Chicago, again in your neck of the woods. He wrote a book on the subject with another academic. Personally, from my vantage point, I'm curious to know how you view this. I think that's a mischaracterization of the role that APAC plays in U.S. politics. I think that APAC and the elite, the political elite of both parties, are ideologically aligned. So APAC doesn't need to control the decision makers in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party because they have the same ideological objectives, effectively, maybe different motivations for having them, but they are on the same page. What APAC does is occasionally when some candidate, perhaps like you, comes along and steps out of line, reveals him or herself not to be aligned with the elite of the party, then they will take measures to destroy that candidate's prospects. But essentially, APAC could be viewed as an instrument of the political elite in the United States rather than as, you know, the controller of that political elite. What's your view about all of this? In particular, how do you respond to my perspective on this?
Well, I think they're part of a larger problem of unlimited money in U.S. politics. The Citizens United decision in 2013 or whatever that was fundamentally changed the way politics functions. It was already pretty expensive before then, but now it's allowed billionaires to have basically, buying an election the way you would buy a car or, or buy a, any big ticket item, a house. And as a result of that, the ability of ordinary folks to have their say represented has diminished significantly. And this is where I'm critical of Democrats as well, to say you can't lecture about the importance of democracy and getting corporate money out of politics while taking corporate money. You can't get angry about the influence of the NRA in politics with the politicians they fund when you're also taking money from these dark corporate entities as well, because it's the same. You're following the same line of reasoning, and you're not going to solve a problem by engaging in the problem itself, right? And so for me, APAC is part of a broader cancer of political corruption and financial corruption in our society, and we're seeing that happening, throughout the country, where the policies are clear based on what the American people want, but because and I'll go back to picking on the gun issue for a moment. 92% of Americans want universal background checks. 92%. There's very little that 92% of Americans agree on, but 92% want universal background checks. Why don't we have them? Because the NRA has pumped enough money into the Republican Party to make them veto or block any possibility of meaningful or comprehensive gun safety legislation. All the data shows that gun safety legislation increases safety. It increases the ability to own guns safely. It decreases violent crime. It decreases murder. I mean, all the data is there. But because you've got this absurd right-wing nut job lobbying arm of the NRA, that will go after Republicans who fall out of line. Republicans won't. You probably recall the horrific mass shooting, the racist white supremacist mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, a couple of years ago, that targeted a black grocery store, predominantly black grocery store. The Republican congressman of that area, after that, said, "Okay, I agree. We need to have better and more comprehensive gun safety legislation." What did the NRA do? They propped up a further right-wing Republican candidate to primary the Republican who wanted gun safety legislation to maintain their stranglehold. And now every other Republican knows that if I dare speak up, the NRA is going to come in, primary me, and I'm out of a job. So to me, it's part of that broader issue, and it's a very deliberate strategy. If you look at the genesis of the Citizens United decision, it was by billionaire financiers who wanted to effectively have more influence in politics. And so they spent the money to overturn the decision, bought the Supreme Court justices like Justice Thomas that they needed to buy. And to them, it's a transaction, right? It's an investment. It's like, it's like you and I deciding that, you know what, I'm not going to spend 4 hours mowing the lawn. I'll just pay somebody, $20 an hour to do it. And that $80, that I'll spend, those 4 hours are worth it, worth something else to me. That's what billionaires do. Like, if I got to spend $500 million to overturn this decision, and it makes me, 20 billion later on, yeah, it's an ROI for me. And that's fundamentally the problem we're dealing with right now.
Right. So I'd like to switch gears again and go back to the subject of Islamophobia, and just so our audience knows, and I mentioned this to you before we began our discussion today on air. You came to my attention as a result of my interactions with an Islamophobe on X, Twitter, about 2 weeks ago. And what happened was I tweeted out something about Islamophobia in Canada, and some person I'd never heard of before, who's from the west coast of Canada and goes by the name of Cat Canada, using K for cat and K for Canada. She's missing a K, I think, responded with an open declaration that she was an Islamophobe, almost proudly stating, "I'm an Islamophobe," and certainly not feeling any embarrassment or reluctance to declare her sentiments towards Muslims. And then I was a little bit taken aback, but I've seen this kind of garbage before on social media. And I just checked quickly her profile and saw, to my distress, that she had over 114,000 followers. And her Twitter feed is just an unending, torrent of hatred towards Muslims and other groups, by the way. In any event, a mutual acquaintance of ours reached out to me at that point. I had not heard of you before because I'm based outside of the United States, and said that you would be someone who would not only have a great deal of interesting and sensitive and insightful things to say about the subject of Islamophobia, but you could also respond effectively to some of the nonsense that we hear from people like Cat Canada. So I wanted to raise with you 3 things that are very commonly said by Islamophobes, certainly in this country and probably in the United States, and just get your brief reaction to these, what I call Islamophobic smears. So the first one, and this is one that this person, Cat Canada, immediately threw at me when I began to criticize her on Twitter for her open Islamophobia. She said that Muslims engaged in forced marriages involving minor females. How do you respond to that particular claim, Qasim?
God, there's so much to unpack with that reckless claim. Let's start by acknowledging that misogyny is a global phenomenon. There are plenty of data and studies done on women's equity and equality on a global scale. There's not a single country in the world, in the East or in the West, that ranks putting men and women on equal footing. Not a single one. You can go to the most, theocratic or the most secular. They all suppress women in some way, shape, or form. So if the only time you care about women is when they're being mistreated by Muslim majority countries, you don't actually care about women. You're just using women as a cover for your xenophobia and bigotry. That's one point. 2, we have to look at what standard she's talking about, because at the end of the day, when you talk about rights afforded to women, um, the right to marry, the right to choose to marry, the right to choose to divorce, the right to inherit property, the right to own property, the right to have a say in civic affairs, the right to get education, to become scholars. These are all rights that women in the West didn't get until the late 1800s, 1900s. I mean, for God's sake, it wasn't until 1974 that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in the United States, giving women access to basic financial independence. All these rights that I mentioned are codified in Islamic jurisprudence from 1400 years ago, right? The Prophet's wife Khadija was a wealthy CEO. After she died, his wife Aisha is considered the greatest jurist in early Islam, and so much of Islamic jurisprudence is learned from her after the Prophet died. Other women were warriors in the battlefield and fierce warriors and renowned for their prowess. The list goes on and on. Lubna of Cordoba was one of the most prolific scientists and scholars in Moorish Spain. Fatima, what is her name? Princess Fatima Al-Fihri is the founder of Al-Qairun University, the world's oldest and longest running university, because the Prophet said that education is incumbent upon every Muslim male and every Muslim female. And so, that's the standard we have to look at, right? And if there's a great piece of scholarship written by Professor Gwendolyn Midlow Hall about Moorish Spain. And she talks about how capital punishment was abolished. The economy was strong. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in relative harmony with one another. People were promoted on merit, not on nepotism. And then she says, but the Moors of Spain were heavily criticized by their contemporaries for one reason. And that is that they were too heavily influenced by their women, that women were given too much power and control in Moorish Spain. And that's why their contemporaries in Europe criticized them relentlessly. So that is a standard that we have to look at. Now, this point about forcing young Muslim girls into marriage, there's no doubt, like I said, on a global phenomenon, that there is misogyny and these horrific crimes that are being committed. The question that we need to ask, though, is are they being committed in accordance to the teaching or in contravention to the teaching? Because from an Islamic standpoint, when at a time when women had no right on who to marry and who to divorce, the Prophet Muhammad mandated that women must be given full choice on who they marry, and they have the right to unilateral divorce. These were rights not afforded to women in Canada or the United States until the 18 and 1900s, right? 1300 years later. When we talk about having legal counsel, women in Islam are afforded legal counsel to manage the marriage and divorce, to ensure that their rights are protected. Nothing like that exists in the West. Imagine for a moment that women here were automatically afforded a lawyer to manage the contract of marriage, and if they choose to get a divorce, to manage the contract of divorce to ensure that their rights are protected. This is a mandate in Islam. The concept is completely alien in the West. But let's talk about child marriage, because in Islam, this is completely banned. It's categorically banned. And the so-called Google scholars who pretend to find the hadith supporting it have, one, no idea what they're talking about. Two, they have no actual concept of what the history teaches. But I just looked it up right before you asked that question about what is the legal age to get married in Canada. And by the way, this was established in 2015. So this isn't like some old law that's been on the books. What do you think is the legal age for marriage in Canada? It's 16. So minor girls
I didn't know that. Wow.
16 can get married. This is Canada. And last I checked, Canada's not some Islamic theocracy. It prides itself on being a secular government. But the people of Canada, majority Christian, I assume, or atheist, decided, you know what, 16 is a good age of consent for girls to get married. It's mind-boggling, the hypocrisy of people. I don't know who this Cat Canada person is. She obviously doesn't have much education or knowledge. But for her to project something that Canada has codified into law as recently as 2015 onto another culture, again, goes to prove that these people aren't actually looking for facts or evidence. They just want to fearmonger. And that's truly unfortunate, because nobody wins when they engage in that kind of bigotry.
Okay, let's deal with smear number two. This is one we hear a lot in this country. And that is that Muslims in Western countries want to impose Sharia law on I think the smear is on the entire populace, basically. And let me just get this off my chest right now.
Yeah.
As I mentioned to you before we began our conversation, my partner is of Algerian origin, although she was born and raised in France. And although she herself is not a practicing Muslim, her parents are. In fact, the vast majority of her large family in France are. And I've also, outside of the marital context, have encountered hundreds of, if not thousands of Muslims in my personal interactions as a lawyer, an activist, and a journalist. I have yet to meet a single Muslim living in a Western country who wants to impose Sharia law on
Yeah.
his community or the country at large. Not a single one. I'm curious how do you know any such people in the Muslim community? And if so, what's that all about?
The irony is that this is all projection. You've got right-wing evangelical Christians passing legislation to mandate the Ten Commandments, to mandate the Bible in school, to mandate prayer in school. There's a recent poll done by I think Gallup or PPP that asked Republicans, should the Constitution be replaced with the Bible? And nearly 60% said yes, that the Constitution should be replaced with the Bible. So this is all projection, first of all. Second of all, it's also ignorant of history because, first of all, Sharia means law. So when people say Sharia law, they're saying law. It's like saying, chai tea, which drives me nuts as well. But the beauty of the Islamic teaching here is that Sharia itself teaches separation of religion and state. The Quran mandates separation of religion and state. It says that that there shall be no compulsion in religion. La ikraha fi din, there shall be no compulsion in religion. And it says that when you give people power in a government, when you entrust them, then you judge, and it could have used the word according to the Quran, according to Sharia, but it uses the word adl, justice, that you judge based on absolute justice, which is a secular principle. And for those who still think that I'm making this up, and that I'm just interpreting these words how I want to, we see the example of Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him. When he fled Mecca after a decade of brutal persecution and arrived in Medina, Medina was a thriving city, a predominantly Jewish city. And his actions there debunked so many contemporary stereotypes and notions. It was a predominantly Jewish city. If Islam was anti-Semitic, why is he going to a predominantly Jewish city? Because Islam's not anti-Semitic. If there was a desire or a demand to impose Islamic teachings on the Jews, then he would have done it. But he did the exact opposite. And he established what's now known as the Charter of Medina or the Constitution of Medina. And people point to the US Constitution or to the Magna Carta as these revolutionary documents, but they miss the Constitution of Medina, which nearly 1,400 years ago, in fact, just over 1,400 years ago now, because I think it was signed in 622 or 623 AD, this was the world's first secular constitution. And among its articles, it flat out said, for example, Muslims and Jews are equal citizens of one state of Medina, right? So this idea that Muslims had to have superiority or impose is debunked in black and white ink right there. It went on to say that no Jewish person shall be wronged for being Jewish, right? A categorical rejection of any kind of religious hierarchy, a condemnation of anti-Semitism in the strongest of terms. And it says that the Jews will be allowed to worship and practice according to their religion, and Muslims will be allowed to worship and practice according to their religion. That is what secular government mandates and teaches. And so we see from the example of the Prophet himself, because remember, he had claimed prophethood. The Quran was there. He could have said, I am the king now, and you will all submit to this authority of the Quran. But he did the exact opposite. He said, let's set up a new constitution, a new document, a secular document. And that is the example that we have to follow. And I would argue emphatically and with the receipts that we had all the time in the world, that there is no religion or ideology in the world that demands more assertively secular governance than that of Islam. Because at the end of the day, that is how we ensure that it is complete religious freedom, there's freedom of belief or non-belief without any oppression whatsoever. You cannot legislate morality, and anybody who tries to do that is kidding themselves. I've always said that a faith that needs force is a cult. This is why Islam categorically rejects the idea of any kind of compulsion in religion. It rejects the idea of theocracy altogether. And these individuals like this Canada person who is making this accusation that Islam wants to impose Sharia, first of all, doesn't understand what Sharia actually is, and second of all, is probably covering for their own intended goal of imposing their own, Christian nationalist worldview, which is what we're seeing happening here in the United States right now.
It's interesting you say that, because my strong sense of reading her violent, offensive Twitter feed is that's precisely what she wants to do. But
Right. Yeah.
uh, so let's quickly move on. I think we can dispense with this last one rather quickly. It's so preposterous it almost rebuts itself, and that is this idea that Muslims are uniquely violent and have committed and are prone to commit acts of violence and violent atrocities more than any other religious group. I just want to say when I encountered this, was one of her followers came back at me on Twitter when I had this recent exchange with her, and this person's I pointed out, of course, that it was Christians or self-professed Christians who committed the Holocaust, not Muslims. I pointed out that Christians, fully self-professed Christians, whether they were actually Christians is another question, but they professed to be Christians, were behind into the institution of slavery in the United States, that self-professed Christians committed a genocide throughout what we now call the Americas, including Canada and the United States, where we live. And this person came back and he said, well, but they've cleaned up their act. And now they've become modern and sophisticated and blah, blah, blah. So how do you respond to this, Qasim?
With data, I mean, in addition to what you said, the data proves the exact opposite to be true. There's a recent poll done by Gallup that asked, is it justifiable for the military to target and kill civilians? And the average, it was never justifiable, sometimes justifiable, and then it depends. It depends, got a couple percent here and there. People didn't really engage in that. The majority of the answers went to it's never justifiable or it's sometimes justifiable. And the average, 38 to 40% of people said it's never justifiable. That's Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and atheists. Between 38 and 43%, it said it's never justifiable to kill civilians. For Muslims, it was 78%. So by 2-1 to every other group out there, Muslims said absolutely not. It is never justifiable to kill civilians. And you point to groups like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS and these groups, and again, it's the dual truths that one, the work that they've done is absolutely condemnable and horrific and barbaric. But as Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago points out, that when you look at all the suicide bombings committed by these terrorist groups that I just mentioned, and you combine them all, they're still subservient to the Tamil Tigers, a Hindu Marxist group in Sri Lanka. And you never hear about them, right? And so there is in there, and I'm not saying Hindus are violent or that they're inherently violent, but I'm saying that the fact that your listeners probably never heard of that until I just mentioned it now should make them reflect on what is a media narrative in this space. And Professor Pape also goes on to point out that more than 95% of these bombings have zero motivation from religion, but they are based on geography and they are based on protecting land in whatever way you can justify it or not, but they are based off of that. Iraq, for example, had zero suicide bombings under Saddam Hussein. This is not a defense of Saddam Hussein. It is to say that the 2,000 plus suicide bombings that it had that did suffer through were in response to this US invasion of Iraq. And that's what motivated the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka as well, right? It was an opposition to colonialism. And John Oliver did a great piece on the stand your ground laws and just the irony of how these right-wing conservatives will say, no, if you come to my house, I have the right to shoot you, even if I have a suspicion that you might cause me any harm whatsoever. And they've passed laws justifying this, but then they can't understand why somebody in another country would also want to engage in violence to protect their homeland as well. I bring up this distinction to point out that the violence here is not motivated by religion. It's motivated by a secular cause. It's motivated by a secular reason. And that's what we need to identify. If we keep trying to buy into this narrative that, well, it's the religion that's violent, or it's the people that are inherently violent because of that religion, then we're missing the fundamental way to actually address the issues. And this ties back into the Israel, Gaza issue that we were talking about earlier as well. But historically speaking, and you don't even need to look at the 19th or 20th century. You go back to the Crusades, you go back to the fact that Muslims and Jews actually lived in relative harmony for centuries in Jerusalem. And it was the Christians who were exiling the Muslims and the Jews. It was the Christians engaging in the mass genocide at that point. It was Christians who were engaging in the Salem witch trials, or the Spanish Inquisition, or the genocide of the indigenous people. I'll close with this story. I was at an interfaith event some time ago, and this pastor lamented that America's lost its way because we forgot Jesus. And I said, well, look, as Muslims, we love Jesus too, so I've got no objection to that part of the comment. But help me understand, if we've lost our way because we forgot Jesus, when was it that we remembered Jesus? Was it during Native American genocide, where we killed 100 million Native American people? Was it during African enslavement, where we enslaved tens of millions of African people? Was it during the 100 years of Jim Crow laws? Was it during the time that we wouldn't allow women to own property, or even vote, or even get a credit card, for God's sake? Was it up until 1993, when marital rape was still justified? Is it now until 2024, where the Equal Rights Amendment still isn't law? Like, help me understand, when was it that we actually loved Jesus or followed Jesus? And obviously he didn't have a response. He didn't, because that's a silly point to make in the first place. And so again, I go back to the data I brought up earlier. To me, this is not a anecdotal argument. This is a factually based argument, and the facts just disprove that notion altogether.
Thank you. I think I'm done with the Islamophobic smears. There's quite a few of them out there. We could go on for hours responding to this crap, but I think hopefully that will give people a sense of your response to these things. Now, I'd like to conclude with where do we go from here? And of course, this is a big subject, and I'm not going to ask you to give us your fulsome thoughts, but maybe in a brief and summary way, what are your views about what policymakers, lawmakers, our institutions in Western countries should be doing that they're not doing in order to address Islamophobia, and particularly the sharp increase in violent Islamophobia that we appear to be experiencing?
I mean, from the leadership perspective, stop engaging in acts that justify Islamophobia. When you're funding war crimes and dehumanizing Muslims, it's going to result in an escalation of Islamophobia. That's fundamentally it. And look, people aren't complicated. People are going to respond to the stimuluses that you give them, and a lot of the hate we're seeing is due to the misinformation. This horrific person that killed Wadea Al-Fayoum was their landlord, and the family was in shock because they're like, we would call him uncle and he would come and play, but he goes very quickly radicalized by the misinformation being spread about Palestinians, about Arabs, about Muslims. The fact that this woman tried to drown a 3-year-old Palestinian girl and then screamed that I will kill you all, and the fact that that woman is now out on bail. She's out on cash bail despite a hate crime and attempted murder is shocking. And so stop justifying it, stop enabling it. We don't need your empty words. We need your meaningful actions. And then the second part is, I always think about when people say it's the most important election of our lifetimes, and then they stop there and say, well, so therefore you got to go out and vote. Well, okay, hold on a second. If voting alone were enough, then all these problems would be solved right now. But it's not. It's a part of the broader process. And so this is where I ask people, especially young people or just anyone who cares about these issues, yes, vote, but make that vote count by putting the work in before the vote. And what I mean by that is, I love basketball. I grew up in Chicago. Michael Jordan is the GOAT. And I'm not going to debate that part of it. But he's recognized for how many game-winning shots he hit and how he came up in the clutch and hit those shots. And those shots may have won the game that particular day, but to get to that shot was 1,000 shots you practiced every day before then. the work he did before then, the fitness, the training, the eating right, the whatever he did to get to that point. And in protecting our democracy, the vote to me is that game-winning shot. It's the attempt. It might go in, it might not, but you increase the chance of it being a game-winning or an election-winning vote by volunteering ahead of time, by donating to candidates that are upholding these values, by running for office yourself, by investing in people, whether it's in an election context or in an education context, with your time and your resources ahead of time. It's not just about showing up on election day and voting. It's what are you doing in the years prior to that to make sure that the person upholding justice has a better chance of succeeding. Instead of just you voting that day, did you pull the 100 people that you know in your network to make sure they come out and vote as well? Because if Dimitri is running for office and he can count on your vote versus he can count on your vote plus 100 people that know you, trust me, Dimitri wants you plus 100 people that know you as well. That's how you make sure that we change our democracy positively. So that's where I ask people not to feel hopeless, but to recognize that it is hard work, but there's no better time now than to get started.